There's a few kinds of drivers that annoy everyone. You probably know them if you've ever been in a car. Type 1 of those drivers, totally annoying. You're in a 30 zone and at city limits, and you see the sign that says 30 zone ending, where you get to drive 50, maybe just 100 meters further, and the car in front of you is going 27. You're at 31, 32 because you know there's a little bit of a tolerance. You think you could start speeding up a little, but then he's going down 27 to 26. Those are the family vans with stickers and names on them, especially those. How annoying. The second type of driver everyone thinks is bad, I think. Have you experienced this one? You're at a red light. You look at the red light, it's orange, it's green, you want to drive, and the moment it turns green, the guy behind you already is honking. What's wrong with you? That's irritating. But there's two types of drivers that aren't only annoying but instinctively make you want to get your gun, which you unfortunately don't have. That's, for example, when you're on a lane on the freeway and there's a traffic jam on the freeway. So that entire lane is jammed, but the right lane next to you is still open. Everyone has to get in that lane, and it takes long. But then there's this one guy or lady, mostly people with a black car. I won't say which brand. That breeze past the whole line and try to cut in at the very front. Do you know the feeling you have when that happens? Or you're on the fast lane, because it's all trucks on the lane next to you. You're already going 140, and then someone behind you darts at 280, flashes you, drives 8 centimeters to your fender and honks. The feeling you get then is a whole nother level. There's a type of person that everyone finds unbearable. And that's not just when you are driving, but also when you have classmates in school. That's the kid who is ridiculously good at English or biology. No problem to gossip about that kid a little. But then there's the one who's always driven to school in her dad's SUV and is good in English and always has the newest clothes and knows they're the coolest kid on the block. And that's exactly the type of person. You'll find them as your colleague or your new boss. There's a character trait, a type of being that makes everyone else go, that's making me sick when I see that person. Everything else is forgiven easier. If someone goes 27 in a 30 zone, that drives me a bit wonky, oh okay. But why do we get so annoyed with that one type of person? I'll call this characteristic that I'm talking about today pride. I don't mean something like I'm proud that I've accomplished something. I mean something else. And I'll try to explain it a little more. Because pride is something our society doesn't see as a negative. We even say you can be proud of yourself. Or we have a full month called Pride Month. I know it's about something else, but pride is associated with something positive. Show your pride. And many celebrities participate this expression. Here I come and I'm totally cool. Maybe some of you remember some characters in politics, including international politics. Or when you see the Bild newspaper or whatever is on TV, this attitude, I'm totally the coolest. I'm actually the prettiest one. I've got it all figured out. It's very common. The interesting part is, this is celebrated in our culture, and yet, if you know someone like that, you think they're unbearable. Just like with a driver, like with a new boss or the colleague where everyone goes, they think they're so cool, but really they're just an idiot. That's pride. The interesting thing about pride is everyone else can see it, except for the person themselves. It's funny, we notice when others say, look what an arrogant, awful person that is. But we ourselves don't see it in ourselves. I have 4 characteristics of pride. The first one is, you yourself can't see it. Pride is the negative character trait that drives people crazy if they are around you, but never with yourself. Almost no one goes around saying, my problem is that I'm proud. No one. It shows how infected we are with it. I'm telling you today about a sickness that affects each of us in different measures. And the telltale sign is that the more affected you are, the less you notice it in yourself. You may see it in others, but not in yourself. And I will try to show you how deep the sickness goes, the sickness of being overly occupied with yourself. How not harmless that is. How deep each of us are affected, but also a way out of it. But first we need to analyze this sickness and need to look and see where the problem is. Pride makes it that you sooner or later will run with your head against the wall. It doesn't work. It's a life model that's doomed to fail. And this eternal truth, it's like a cosmic law. It's already been described hundreds, even thousands of years ago in the Bible. There is a passage where Jesus says, "He who elevates himself will be humble. Who humbles himself will be lifted up." It's a principle that applies no matter if you're religious or believe something or not. It's a cosmic principle. To try and do everything your way in order to be big, to elevate yourself, sooner or later it won't work. Sooner or later it breaks down, and someone who wasn't trying to make themselves important will sooner or later see something grow from that. That's my theory. It's this basic principle. But sometimes we only learn this the hard way. We need a long time. The first trait is, you yourself don't see it. This principle, who elevates themselves will be humbled. I needed to learn that in a relative young years. I'll tell you a story that is embarrassing for me, but it happened just like this. I was 11 or 12 in 5th or 6th grade, and it was a reading contest. And I was a little nerd back then. I was great at reading, bad at soccer. I read a lot. And of course I thought that I had done a great job at that reading contest. And in the end there was a vote. Everyone could vote with a note who did the best reading. And it was a secret vote. But of course I voted that I had done best. Unfortunately, through the vote counts, people figured out that I voted for myself. And in that moment, the whole class was like, you know what that feeling, ugh. How annoying. You voted for yourself that you did the best job. It's annoying because it's just not cool. Who elevates themselves will be humbled, no matter who read the best in the competition or not. Simply the fact that someone comes and says, I was the best, it takes something away. And it was something characteristic and tragic. The person who thinks they are the greatest, everyone else think, what kind of person are you? Pride feels so great, but it has a terrible side effect. Pride makes you lonely. The higher you think of yourself, the less you are capable of community. And why is that? Well, there is several negative traits. One trait is that someone may not take truth so seriously. They lie here and there. There's a trait where someone might steal a few cans of beer at the gas station. Not good. But what's different about pride compared to these traits? One thing. In pride, there's no community. There can be community in stealing, because I can go drink those beer with two friends even if it's not right. There's even community in gossip and lying. In all morally negative things there is an option to band together, but not with pride. Because if you are proud of something, you're just proud not in the sense of content, but in the sense of arrogance. Then you can't be happy with anyone else, because they could have more than you. The girl in class who thinks she's the prettiest, she won't be able to say you are also pretty, because that would imply that she's no longer prideful. Pride is competitive. There's only you or me. And pride won't celebrate when I have a beautiful house. I'll only be happy if my house is bigger than yours. And if your house is bigger, I'll be totally sad. Pride isn't happy about success or about a fast car or good food and the money you have. If you were to rejoice with the others, then it would be much better. But pride only enjoys having more or being better or whatever, always being the top person. That's why pride is by definition also animosity. Pride is incapable of community, and so pride is the foundation of probably most broken families, every war between nations, every crime and almost all evil.
Jedes Verbrechens, fast alles Übel, das es in der Welt gibt, hat irgendwas mit Stolz zu tun. Und Stolz klingt,
you could say pride thinks a bit too much of themselves, but no, you have to think this to the end. What happens if we make this poison our habit, make it normal? We become incapable to see who the other person is. And why is that? I'll tell you another story. It's funny and also embarrassing. The young people would call it cringe. Namely, it was a few years ago at the opening lecture of a young professor I know well. And I was invited to their opening lecture. You need to picture this. There was a renowned, famous professor. He was like, what do you call it? Not the doctoral supervisor, but one step further. So he'd been alongside the project, and he was famous. He founded a scientific institute, and he was the pro in this field and already an older man. And this young professor was in his late 20s or early 30s. And that evening we later on went to the Italian restaurant. Everyone celebrated the young professor and said, how cool you made it, you're a professor now, so great. And then I sat at the table with the famous old professor and the young newly appointed professor who hadn't done much scientific research yet, but it was his party. And then the young professor says to the old one like, Professor, I must admit you are better at science, but in tennis, I've so far beat you every time. Just as a joke, because they had played tennis together. But suddenly the old professor with 50 years of publication, super famous, his face was like, what? When did you beat me in tennis? No, the last match was even. And the time before that, the ball was out of the field. No, I actually won that. Totally embarrassing. It was an embarrassing situation because it was just a joke as you sit with a Chianti wine or so. But he didn't think it was funny. He was not amused. The idea that he lost at tennis. And like a little kid, that's what pride does. That a 70-year-old man who actually accomplished so much in life becomes like a child by saying, no, I have the bigger banana and you have that thing and mine is better. And it's sad. Pride makes you dumb. And even absurd. Again, the principle, who elevates themselves will be made humble. It breaks down. It makes you dumb because the prideful one only sees themselves. But the truth is never just me. The truth is somewhere out there. I want to demonstrate this to you. And then let's try to get to the bottom to this, what the dramatic part really is. See, here's an example coming from Viktor Frankl, a famous psychologist. I've mentioned him several times because he's just so good. Here's an eye. And the eye is made to see something. Like, for example, the sun. The eye sees the sun. And if the eye is healthy, it sees the sun. Pride is when the eye does something else, namely the second option. Here's the eye again. And the eye decides to say, you know what, the sun doesn't matter. Sunsets and stars and such, no one cares. The most interesting thing to see around here is me. It's the eye. I'll just look at myself. It's interesting. The best example for pride is a mirror. The eye looks at itself. And Viktor Frankl says it so well. An eye that sees itself is sick. If you see something in your view, the upper right part of your eye, it means you have a clouded lens. A healthy eye doesn't see themselves. And philosophically speaking, that's deep. We humans are oriented towards others and in the final sense to God. And something breaks inside of us. Something is twisted in us when we primarily look at ourselves. The way I am so good. I'm actually bad. Aha, that's so interesting about my inner self. And I need to look here how popular I can be. That's a sign that our inner eye has become sick. And it had lost the ability to see something bigger than itself. That's a philosophical explanation for what I just told you about the professor. He was only busy thinking about, am I the better tennis player? It didn't matter. The evening was about the other person, but he wasn't able to see the other person. And that's what pride does. And it's the reason why proud people also can't pray. Why proud people can't believe. Because they would have to see something bigger than themselves. The prideful look down on everything. But God is above him. And he can't look above him because he'd have to look away from himself. I'm not sure if it's true, it's a harsh judgment. But I think that pride is one of the main reasons why people don't believe in God. Because then there would be something bigger than themselves. Few people have said it out loud. One guy was honest, and that's Friedrich Nietzsche. He said, if God were real, how could I stand not being God? At least he was honest. A modern contemporary philosopher, Thomas Nagel, wrote in a very interesting book called Spirit and Cosmos. He doesn't believe in God, and neither do all his atheist colleagues. But he observes in himself the wish that there is no God. He doesn't want God to exist. And he writes honestly in the book and asks, where does this wish come from? You can really ask yourself that. Where does it come from? Maybe it's a desire in us that I am the measure of all things. And that's the definition of pride. A person who doesn't make truth the measure of all things, but only themselves. Who doesn't judge the world according to what is good and what is true, but according to what is useful to them, what it does for them, if they get something out of it, if it advances them in the pursuit of their own goals. And this is the hard truth. They also do this to other people. If others are useful to them or not, and if they fit in their plan or not. And that's why pride doesn't only make you dumb or lonely, but pride even makes you evil. Pride makes us truly evil. Because a prideful person, and we all are affected by this, doesn't really have the other person's best in mind, but they manipulate and abuse the other and use them for their own purposes. There's an essay writer I really like, G.K. Chesterton. He lived around 100 years ago in England. And he wrote an interesting essay. He says, imagine you were to walk into a pub. You'd buy random nice gentlemen some cigars and beer and then say in a relaxed conversation, you know, by the way, Christian theologians and Jewish theologians think that pride is the greatest of all sins, and that pride is the reason why Satan rebelled against God. And he said, like, okay, they'd all laugh and drink another beer or so. What's he talking about? And he says, no, just stay a bit longer and listen to the people how they talk about others. They'd prove you right by how they talk of other people. Then they might say that there's this guy, well, he's loose with women, not exactly loyal, but they sort of smile about it. But then there's this other guy, and he's the kind to have affairs and play with women, but he's proud of it. And everyone hates that guy because everyone knows he's an, well, you know. And then there's this guy where everyone knows he's a bit greedy, not generous, but they laugh about it. But then there's other people who are proud to be greedy. And that's not great. And then there's people who are arrogant, but also other people who are proud to be arrogant, and they are like that with pleasure. And Chesterton says, listen to the guys at the pub with their cigars and beer. When they talk about these people, the mood changes. Doing bad is one thing, but if you're proud of it, Chesterton says, There's a cold feeling in the air, as if the devil was among them. And Chesterton says exactly, because pride is the sin of the devil. And about this strange idea, by the way, regardless of whether you believe in such things or take them literally, about this idea that pride is at its core an evil thing, that's what I want to think about with you. I said pride is to be unable to really see anything else. And Chesterton writes it so well. Hey, I'd rather you get drunk and enjoy your wine, or that you buy something and burn money and enjoy it. At least enjoy something. But the prideful doesn't enjoy anything but themselves. And that's the worst. Rather rob a bank than you have, okay, don't rob anyone. Anything is less inhumane than the pure, I'm enough in myself, no one can compare, I'm surrounded by a cabinet of mirrors. That's ice cold. And amazingly, that is the exact story that's told in the Old Testament about the Prince of Tyre. It's a bit odd. Who was this Prince of Tyre? First of all, Tyre is a city in southern Lebanon today. I went there once. It's an ancient city which was important to the Phoenicians, maybe not 2000 BC, but 1000 BC as a trade center. And their wealth came mainly from trading purple snails. These were used to dye red fabric. And there's prophetic books in the Old Testament, books where men wrote texts down that they have received to show God's perspective on the world. Not rarely the texts are about how some king who seems all great is not so great in God's eyes. It's a reoccurring theme. The thing that looks great on the outside is not so great in reality. And it's similar in this story. God says here to the Prince of Tyre, the head of Tyre, the boss of this mighty trade city of Phoenicia, modern-day southern Lebanon, your heart was proud, and you said, I am a god. A residence of God is my home, and by the sea. Yet you are only a man and not God, though you believed in your heart that you are a god. That's the essence of pride. There's some funny jokes I remember from my time in college. They remind me of the story with the professor. We told jokes like, what's the difference between a German professor and God? God doesn't think he's a German professor. Well, really funny. The essence, I'm the measure of all things, is the essence of pride. But it continues. Now it gets more extreme. A few verses later it says, now say this about the king of Tyre. Wait a minute. We are talking about the prince. He's already the highest political boss of Tyre. And now it says, Son of man. Verse 2. Actually, a little later, Son of man, raise a lament over the death of the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord, you were a beautiful crafted seal, full of wisdom and complete beauty. And it goes on, suddenly it says, you went into the mount of God, you were a cherub. A cherub is an angel. The middle of Eden was your home. You have to read this, Ezekiel 28, it's crazy. Great glory is described, gold, jewels. And you were a complete seal, full of wisdom and complete beauty. It's described. And then a few verses later it says, but you became proud because you were so beautiful. You have destroyed your beauty, blinded by shining glow. Friends, whether you take this literally or not, believe it or not, this is an Old Testament image, a story of what the devil is like. The devil in the Old Testament isn't the guy with a trident or a suit-covered face. He's personified pride. And of course, there's also funny depictions in literature about Lucifer, who was an angel who was cast down to hell. They're funny, sometimes very touching or naive ideas. But the thing that's said in this particular passage is, you were so beautiful and great that you thought, hey, I am actually like God. I don't need God anymore. I can just as well look at myself. Here it says that's the essence of what happened. And let's be honest, it's in essence a tendency that also exists in every human being. And it's described in the Bible as demonic, as devilish, as deeply evil, as the core of evil. Pride makes you evil. If you study the most powerful and evil people, the biggest criminals, the most evil humans of history, the Stalins and Hitlers of the world, they weren't just cruel, they were deeply proud. In the end, it wasn't about the German people, they didn't care. Really, they cared about their own self-absorbed madness. And what starts out harmless, okay, they're a little vain, well, it's like a worm that eats into us and that is anything but innocent. It's not innocent. But because we don't wake up one morning to feel like Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler, we live out our normal lives. That's okay. Otherwise, it would be quite exhausting after a while. I want to give you 7 signs of pride in passing.
7 Kennzeichen des Stolzes im Vorbeigehen nennen.
Things we might relate to, because they are more everyday things, yet at a closer look aren't so harmless.
Gar nicht so harmlos sind. Einfach nur. 7.
The first sign of pride is it's everyone else's fault.
Andere sind schuld.
The prideful can never say to us that they take responsibility. It's my thing. The prideful always holds a grudge about everything and everyone. All my 14 ex-wives and the politicians and the neighbors and my former boss and the boss before that, they were all idiots. The idea that among those 14 exes, maybe part of it was me, because I'm the only common denominator in those marriages. A proud person won't have that idea, because it's everyone else's faults, not me. From the mouth of a proud person, you'll never hear, man, I messed up. I'll take responsibility. You won't hear that. But you also won't hear the positive. A proud person can't gush. To gush means to flow over with passion for something. If you're gushing, praising something, you aren't just with yourself. The prideful can criticize well, but they cannot praise. They can't flow over with gushing. And that's totally sad. Next sign of pride is, and I think we're all included in this one, to rather talk than listen. To listen is the greatest practice of the opposite of pride. It's humility. Because if you can listen, it means, just like the eye we talked about here, you don't stay revolved around yourself. We all like to hear ourselves talk. It's always interesting what I have to say. It's just the others that talk so slow and boring. It requires me to say goodbye to my ego. That's not easy for us. Rather talk than listen. That's a sign of pride. And of course, a sign of pride is to smash criticism. None of us like to hear critical feedback. It's not fun. A non-proud way to deal with it is, okay man, hurts to hear that, but I'll think about it. You don't need to applaud it when someone criticizes you. Pride knocks it down. How dare you? Just look at yourself. I know I've always said it this way. Unable to even hear criticism. And of course, if someone dares to say something wrong or to criticize, pride likes to get offended. It likes to be hurt. And here again, As I just came here with my bike, I was at a crossing and another biker passed. I stopped too late, so he had to avoid me. And nice as people are on the road, he threw an insult at me. And I could tell how I got upset. I was offended. But the truth is, it really was my mistake. I don't think it's cool how he reacted to it. But to be offended shows how important it is to us to be seen and respected and honored. And friends, to some extent, this is normal. But it's also somehow normal that someone might be rude to you, that someone treats you poorly in traffic or wherever. That's life. But the prideful person takes every offense so bitter and doesn't see reconciliation, and everything gets so incredibly personal. But the other way around, the sixth point, I only came up with this recently, it looks harmless, but it isn't. I like Taylor Swift well enough. There's this fun song, I'm gonna shake it off, shake it off, shake it off, where she says, if someone criticizes you, just shake it off. Partially that's cool. In the sense of, don't let other people's opinions drag you down, let them talk. A German band also sang that once, let the people talk and just don't listen. It's part of the truth. The part that's true is, don't be dependent on the judgment of others. But if you reject all input from other people, you will be incredibly proud. So, I once met a 20-year-old man. He said he wanted to be a professional musician. I asked him, what education do you have? Did you study? Well, no, I taught myself. And now you think you're pretty good. Absolutely, I'll put it online and it will go through the roof. I said, have you ever posted something online? Yeah. Then I said, how many clicks did it get? 180. I said, well, I mean, if you had 180,000, that would be one thing. But don't you think you might need a little coaching first? Oh, no. That's what I mean. And there are people who are convinced they know it better, that they're above all input from other people. They just smash it down. They don't ask for an opinion. And friends, that's the flip side of this self-worth building stuff. It's also part of raising our kids. You're amazing, no matter if people see it. You're a gift to humanity, and that's true. But you're a gift to humanity that might need to be refined in a few places. That's a normal process. And some already consider that an attack on their personhood. That someone would even say, no, in art class there's grades on the pictures, how dare you? That's the picture of my daughter or my son, and it's an expression of his personality. Yeah, sure, but there's still room for improvement. A proud person can't stand that. A proud person must always reject judgment up front.
Have you noticed there are no ads on this channel? This is the only one. There's one reason for that. This channel is funded by donations only. If you want to help us to continue with this work, you find everything about supporting us below in the description. Now enjoy the rest of the video.
And the last thing, a proud person cannot stand. A proud person can't kneel. A proud person can't see anything greater above themselves. And friends, how sad such a lifestyle, yet how familiar it is to us. And now the question is, how do you get out of this? How do we get out? And the bad news up front, not by ourselves. It won't go away by itself. At least, I'm not as much an expert on other philosophies, but not according to Christianity or the Bible. The Bible is extremely clear about the topic of pride, front to back. And the answer it gives is, declare war on this thing. It's an absolutely deadly poison for your heart. You can't make peace with it in your heart. And it has nothing to do with healthy self-acceptance. That's something else. I'll get to that later. This tendency to elevate, call ourselves something better, is in all of us, inside all of us. We read, for example, in one of the early New Testament letters, James, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. We heard earlier the statement, whoever humbles themselves will be lifted up, whoever lifts themselves up will be humbled. What's said again very clearly is, humble yourself. It means it's something I need to actively do. Be actively ready to take the second place. Be willing to abstain from something that would be your right. Actively make an effort in yourself to cultivate this in you. I speak for myself here. I'm affected by all these points. But we need to see reality. You cannot cultivate love and glory and all these good things in your life and at the same time breed arrogance. It can't be both at once. The beauty is, there's not only pride, but there's also the opposite virtue, which you hardly hear about these days. It's not often described as a virtue. And the virtue is humility. Humility in the German language sounds very odd. They let people do whatever, they're a doormat. But humility is something beautiful because it's the opposite of all that. Humility does not need to smash criticism, but humility is teachable. Humility says, I want to hear. I'll give you in passing, I wrote them down because they're easy to remember. 7 signs of humility. It's teachable. Secondly, humility is willing to serve. That's where the word in Middle High German comes from, Dienemüte, the attitude to serve. Humility is also to give something, to see others as higher. Humility can honor others. That's something the prideful person can't do. They can't gush. Humility can. Humility can put others at the center and honor them. Humility is grateful. Pride can't be grateful because it believes it deserves everything. Humility is grateful. Humility listens. Humility is willing to forgive. And humility lifts others up. Those are my 7 signs. Do you know what's not a sign of humility? To think badly of yourself. Some think humility means I'm a poor soul. No, humility doesn't mean you think badly of yourself. Humility means that you don't think about yourself much at all. Neither good nor bad. Because you're busy being happy about the beautiful world and God and your kids or other people, of the glass of white wine you're drinking. You enjoy yourself. Humility is joy. Humility gives you what pride promises you, yet never delivers. I could have also titled the talk, The Art of Finding Friends. Because anyone who is thankful, someone who honors others, someone who is ready to forgive and not be bitter about everything, who is capable of encouraging others, who wouldn't want to be in the presence of such a person? Look, this principle, who humbles themselves will be lifted up, is a fundamental principle. Once again, no matter if you believe in something or not, it's the path of success. It's the path to friendship. Because it's a pleasing aroma on the heart level. If someone has these 7 characteristics, if they are teachable, that means they let people correct them. If someone is ready to serve, just to do something even if it's not cool. If they are ready to honor others, not just themselves, but also show someone else as positive, who can be thankful, who can listen and not just talk all the time. If you're ready to forgive and encourage others, that's humility. What I can talk about in this talk today, only in passing, because I'm not an expert on it, the deeper reasons for pride. And people who are prideful to a sick degree are narcissists. Narcissus. It comes from the Greek myth of Narcissus. He was handsome, but the world didn't appeal to him. It wasn't beautiful enough for him. Until one day he looked in a pond and finally saw something he found beautiful enough, his own mirror image. And he fell in love with his own image. The story ends badly for Narcissus, but that's where the word comes from. And narcissism, if you're interested in it, I read a book about it, which I can recommend, by a psychologist. I'm not a psychologist, so I can only refer to it briefly. There are good presentations on it on the internet. Or also the book Narcissism, the Inner Prison by Heinz-Peter Röhr. And what he describes is really tragic. He tells a fairy tale as an example by the Grimm brothers about a son of a king who was cursed by an evil witch. And he was cursed that he had to sit in an iron oven in the woods. Heinz-Peter Röhr interprets this parable, this fairy tale, as what happens to narcissistic people. Narcissistic disorder means a person is proud to a sick degree, obsessed of thinking of themselves and their own grandeur, even though they aren't great. Classic extreme narcissism is more common in men than women. There's also female narcissists. It's a bit more hidden. If you're interested, I highly recommend. There's several videos about it on YouTube, and this book is also good. But this story, if I can believe the psychological interpretation, it seems very plausible to me. Like this, in all of us, there's a simple little person. And they are worthy of love and protection, but also vulnerable and hurt. And none of us was loved in a complete way. And what he describes in his book is, now there was someone in this story, it was the witch who enchanted the person. It means they put the wish on the person. And he says narcissism develops when parents, often the mothers, if the boy is narcissistic, elevate that person. Because they look at them in an admiring way. And she wishes for something. You're my greatest. Maybe also a replacement for a partner because the man isn't always around. But it's not really love, it's idolization. Narcissistic, proud people often say my childhood was wonderful. I was the sunshine of the family. And eventually, from this treatment, a false ego develops. A grandiose, self-inflated ego. I'm amazing. I've always learned that I'm radiant and the world is at my feet. And the bad thing that happens here is, as Heinz-Peter Röhr at least puts it, that like an armor forms, like an iron oven. An armor of being untouchable. I don't need anyone. I'm enough for myself. And if people come around, I'll keep them at a distance. Or I need to check, are they useful to me or not? But look, do you know what happens through pride? You get lonely. True connection won't happen because I'm arrogant, grandiose me. Narcissistic, proud people are the poorest people because they don't see themselves clearly. They don't realize I'm not well and I'm not in a good place. Actually, I desire intimacy, but it's everyone else's fault. And I'm doing it right. It's a terrible, terrible prison. These people constantly look for validation for their grandiose superego, who go crazy, no partner is good enough, and who deep down are starving for intimacy and love. Because what they got was validation and glorification and maybe all sorts of toys, but no true love, not real love. That hurts me. I can't show in a talk like this how to get out of it. And honestly, I lack the psychological expertise. But for us, it's important to understand that all people come into this world with a great need for love. And only when it's not met, and it isn't met perfectly for any of us, we get weird. Then we build these constructs and a false self and so on. That's how it happens. People would most likely get out of this if they recognized how powerless they truly are deep down inside. Quick note on the she. With men, it's statistically more common, if I understand literature correctly, that they get into this extreme arrogance. With women, narcissism is often like they glorify their partner and elevate them and almost become addicted to the relationship. Do your own research, but here again, it's never enough for them. And no partner is enough. And deep down, I can't come to peace in myself because I don't know who I am, since I built a false sense of self. With women, the false self is more likely connected to all sorts of relationships. With men, it's often the false self through, I'm just the coolest person around. And both is a deep pain. To recognize lack of power. And in the end, it's the question, who would I be without this recognition? If someone didn't get their recognition, if they were to fast and say, I'll go into stillness a few days, I'll abstain from being glorified, then deeper things would come up much quicker, where you realize there's a lot of pain, and sooner or later there might be grief. Where you recognize in all this glory and being lifted up, I deep down was still lonely and not truly loved as I thought. And this pain could become an open door to healing. That's a little field trip to psychology. The hard part is our society encourages the development of false self. Totally. Our society encourages you to work too much and earn money and only present something even when you end up alone. Yeah? Our society glorifies it when you define yourself by property and status, even if in the end nobody knows you, nobody gets close, and you don't know yourself and basically lose yourself. What a scam. Building a tower of Babel of pride, superficial. And what an incredible story we read, how God comes up with a rescue plan to come into the human story. And I became aware of that in a new way. In the Christian story, God goes the completely opposite direction. So the human way goes, I am poor and a nobody, so I need to make myself look great, even if it makes me cold and untouchable. In the Bible, we get a completely different story. And it's written in Philippians. This is one of the most early Christian songs or hymns. It reads, Christ Jesus was in very nature God, yet did not consider holding on to being like God. He humbled himself, made himself nothing, and became a slave in human likeness. His life was that of a man. He was obedient even unto death. And in this descent of Jesus, he even includes all our hurt, sad and lonely parts, and he becomes real small. He becomes a child. That's the movement. If it's true what Christianity teaches, then humility has saved the world. Of course, also love, but love is humble. And if it's true that there was someone who was God, yet became a slave in free will, that's the opposite of what we heard earlier with the king of Tyre, and how all human history is. And it's so incredible what action options we are offered when we follow this Jesus. For example, here, in one of these letters, Paul wrote, "You are loved of God. You are his elected holy people. Therefore clothe yourself with upright mercy, goodness, humility, gentleness, and patience."
Hier wird nicht gesagt,
It doesn't say you're a
du bist ein
nobody, a sinful
Nichtstu's,
pig, so
ein
don't think of
Sünderstein,
yourself.
deswegen bildet dir auch nichts ein. Du bist ja
You're
bist ja
nothing.
gar nichts.
Some people
So
think
wie
that's what
manche Leute
humility
denken,
is about,
deswegen
but it's
zeige
not.
ich's nicht so. Sondern
Here
hier
it says you are loved.
ihr seid von
Hey,
Gott-
loved by
von
God,
Gott
that's
geliebt, ist nicht
amazing.
was. Ich meine,
The boss
der
of the
Chef des
universe,
Universums,
if
wenn
he
der dich
loves you,
liebt,
your
das ist
chances
der
are
gute
good.
Taten.
Paul says you're so
Ihr
incredibly
seid
valuable.
von
You're loved
Gott
by God
geliebt,
and are
ihr
his
seid seine
chosen
auserwählten
saints.
Heiligen. Heilige,
Saints,
das
it
klingt
sounds
ein bisschen
odd,
eigenartig,
but it simply
aber
means
gemeint,
you're
für
so
ihn
important to
unfassbar
him, he
wichtige Menschen, die
handpicked
sich
you.
handverlesen
And
haben,
that's
das
you.
bist du doch. Und
So
deshalb
clothe yourself,
kleide dich
not
nicht
in cold
in
armor or
Panzer,
grandeur,
Kälte und Grandiosität,
but clothe
sondern
yourself with
kleide
honest
dich,
mercy.
kleide dich mit aufrichtigen Erbarmen.
Mercy means you
Erbarmen,
don't
dass
need
du
to pay
nicht
back
alles
everything in
Umsonst
bitterness.
zahlen musst. Kleide
Clothe
dich also
yourself
mit
in
Güte,
goodness.
dass
Be a
du
kind
herzlich
person.
bist.
Clothe
Kleide
yourself,
dich
cover
mit
yourself with humility.
mit Demut.
Put
Zieh
on
Demut
humility
wie ein
like a
Gewand
garment,
an,
with
mit
gentleness
Milde,
and
mit
patience.
Geduld. Der
The
Punkt
point
ist nicht,
isn't that God
dass
feels
sich
threatened when you
bedroht
get too
fühlt, wenn du zu
big.
groß
No
bist.
worries,
Keine Sorge,
you
du
won't
bist ihm
become a
nicht
danger to
zur
him.
Gefahr.
He
Er
isn't
fühlt sich
threatened,
nicht
but
zu
pride
groß.
is lack of
Er fühlt sich nicht
peace.
bedroht, sondern Stolz
Pride is
ist
animosity.
Stolz
Pride
ist
is loneliness.
Stolz ist
Pride is
Einsamkeit.
coldness.
Stolz ist Kälte.
Pride is
Stolz
incredibly
ist
exhausting.
unfassbar anstrengend. Weil dieses
Because
falsche
to
Bild
hold up
auf
this
dich zu
false
halten,
image of
macht
yourself
dich
makes
so
you
unnahbar
untouchable
und
and
so
quite
unberührbar
strange.
und so komisch und es ist
It's
so,
exhausting.
es ist so anstrengend. Und deswegen
And so Jesus
sagt
says,
Jesus,
"Come
kommt
to
alle
me,
zu mir, die euch
all
plagt und
who
schwere
are
Lasten
heavy
zu tragen
laden.
habt.
I
Ich
will
werde euch
give you
Ruhe
rest."
verschaffen.
He doesn't say, "Come to me and I'll give you more religious stress you can never keep up with." There's so many false forms. There will always be false forms, but this is the original, what Jesus says. Take my yoke and learn from me. That means he says, be a student with me. To take up the yoke was a figure of speech that you would go study with a rabbi, a teacher. Jesus says, let me be your coach. Take me as your spiritual leader. Learn from what I have lived out. Do as I did. Learn from what I've lived by example, for I am gracious and humble at heart. These two words, gracious and humble at heart, those are the only adjectives Jesus used to describe himself. Jesus never says, I'm loving and upright. Jesus never said, I look good and I'm educated. None of the recorded words of Jesus use adjectives where he describes himself, except these two. That's significant. No matter what you think of Jesus, this is how he describes himself. I am gracious. I don't have a harshness. I don't have a sharp, condemning edge. I have a wide open heart. That's what it means to be gracious. And I'm humble. Wow. God is humble? Yes, God is humble. And the result is interesting. He says, you will find rest for your soul. In humility, this, I don't need to pretend before God because I'm loved by Him, even in my brokenness, even in my bad things. And I don't need to prove myself anymore or force everyone to see how great I am. In Him is rest for your souls, from all that costs energy. What wears you out, this striving for success.
Ihr Lieben, es ist tatsächlich so, dass manchmal Gott
And friends, it's really so that sometimes God uses hard situations to break through this armor.
durchzubrechen.
This is how it was for Paul. He was quite the famous guy. You have to picture this today like a person from high society of prominence. How he gets out of this whole thing and declares he'll go to a monastery or something. Like that, but more radical. Paul was someone who persecuted Christians and was a scholar. And he experienced that God literally knocked him off his high horse and broke down his life plans. And he was incredibly intelligent too. He wrote the kinds of letters we read earlier. At one point, Paul writes, I have received so many insights and visions from God that there's one thing I keep fighting with in my life. It costs me much energy. Then I ask God, please, we don't know what it is. He calls it a thorn in the flesh. And I asked God, take it away. And God said, no, I won't do that. For my strength is sufficient to you and is made full in your weakness. Then Paul says, when I'm weak, then I'm strong.
Denn sie wird vollendet, wenn du schwach bist. Und dann sagt Paulus, wenn ich schwach bin, bin ich stark. Das heißt,
it means Paul says God sometimes allows things in his life that are actually humiliating for him in order to keep him touchable.
Ihn an diesem Punkt der Berührbarkeit zu halten.
And this is important for you to understand. If God allows you that you are humbled, it's not to throw you under the bus or because you're worthless, but to prevent you from running into arrogance or your own grandeur. And so you remain approachable. For him, it's more important that he stays in close relationship to you than for you to make it on the outside. Otherwise, God would have told Paul, surely, I'll take the thorn from your side. And the whole story of Israel as well. These stories like Joseph in Egypt, they are full of stories where people go through dark valleys and a lot of bad things, where you might ask why. We might say, God, how mean of you. If that's how you treat your friends, said Teresa of Avila, if that's how you treat your friends, God, no wonder you have so few of them. So sometimes it can feel like that. And over these stories end this way. But who humbles themselves will be lifted up. So who goes with it will be lifted up. So where was that true? With whom is that true? With Jesus it was so. Christ Jesus was like God, but didn't insist on staying like God, but humbled himself and became a slave. And like humans, Philippians 2, his life was that of a man. He was obedient to death, even to death on the cross. That's the deepest death, the worst criminal death. Literally to be tortured on a garbage heap. Truly a free will step down. Not to pay God something through pain, but because that's what love does. Love is humble. Love doesn't hold on to its rights. Love is willing to serve. But it doesn't end there. But for this reason, God lifted him up above all things and gave him the name above all names, so that in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, every knee shall bow, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. There's a passage in the last book of the Bible called the book of Revelations, where John sees an open heaven and the angels and all that is there. And in chapter 4, verse 5, it says, there's this question, okay, who can break the seal and read the scroll? So figuratively, who has insight into wisdom of this world? Who can be Lord of the universe? Who is worthy to take this place? And everyone says, oh, no idea, not me either. And John says, suddenly I saw a lamb that looked like it was slain. That's a symbol for Jesus. The lamb is the dumbest animal you can imagine. It's a herd animal, and you make wool from it, and in the end it's butchered. At the same time, it was the animal for sacrifices in the Old Testament. And about Jesus it says that he's the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of others, the problems others threw around, the crap others got into. He takes all of it on him. And suddenly John sees the heavens open, and this lamb that was slain is crowned, and all honor and power to rule is put at his feet. Then all in heaven and earth say, worthy is the lamb to receive power, honor, wisdom, and glory. For he was slain and purchased all people by his blood for God. Friends, that's our story. Who lifts themselves will be humbled. Who humbles themselves will be lifted up. And the one who was lifted higher than anyone else and was at the lowest point anyone could go, he was lifted up to be the highest name. That's the Messiah we follow. And it's the deepest reason why humility is beautiful, why it's great to be humble. why pride doesn't belong to us, is so wrong, so unnecessary and useless. It's about time to break free from pride and wrap yourself in a coat of humility and learn lifelong from this school, the school of love, because we are accepted, we are loved, and have affirmation, and no longer need to fight for it.